Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, and this week we are back with something, again, special, different. It's not a new guest because we've had Steve before, but before we get started into all the jazz and explain what we're doing today, I need to know, Steve Bocska, are you prepared to engage?
I'm always prepared to engage. Thank you, Professor.
Let's do this because Steve is a Boy Scout for engagement. And as you would have probably seen him before, he was in episode 68. So if you want to, know about the typical questions of, Steve's one-time failure, the only time in his whole career that he ever failed and, got back up, because there were no more failures in his career. Just kidding, again. If you want to know about a big success, the process that Steve was following back then. If you want to know all of these things, you can go back to episode 68. You will find it in the show notes, understand who Steve is and all those things. You can see them there. But today, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different because Steve, and we will have more details towards the end, Steve is going to be giving a free webinar on some of his new frameworks and some of the stuff they've been using recently. And again, we will get into details about that. But before that, Steve, we want to know, what are you doing lately? What are you up to? What are some of the latest projects you've been working on? Of course, those you can reveal. What have you been up to, Steve? What's Pug Interactive been up to these past, months?
Oh, it's been a fun little stretch, Rob, I have to say. And appreciate you having me back on. I'm grateful for you introducing me as special and then very quickly flipping the script and talking about my failures. So maybe what makes me special are my failures. That said, we've had a great little run since we spoke last. We've had some very exciting projects and very large-scale implementations of our platform. When last we spoke, you'll remember I was talking about our net engagement score, this model, this methodology for measuring the engagement health of your community. And I'm very happy to report that model continues to show excellent efficacy and utility around being able to measure and properly diagnose where there's problems within your community. So it's a very early stage idea, however, because the principles in it are based on some very time-tested ideas and the psychology of motivation. What we're finding is that even though the idea is new, there are very little growing pains with it. So it's been a great run, and now I'm really excited to talk about, like you said, this free webinar. Usually, I would say that something free is worth what you pay for it, but in this case, I'm very happy to report that we are actually very excited about what we're about these ideas that we're bringing forward, and looking forward to creating a brand new dialogue like we did the last time about a new idea that we have, and hoping that it resonates with your listeners.
Absolutely. So, Steve, you've been mentioning about what we were speaking, what we spake. I'm reading the Lost Tales of Tolkien. And it's funny how they mention all these words, and it's because he wrote it like in 1920 or something like that.
Wait, the Lost Tales? This isn't the first three? This is something else?
There is the three books. There is the the Hobbit, and there's the Silmarillion. There is something that was what he was initially writing, because I don't know if you've read the Silmarillion. It's just written in a general, these are the things that happened. This one is written from a person who's called Ariel, who is listening to the story of the Valar and all these, the elves and so on, told by a very ancient elf who has apparently all of this information, or several very ancient elves. And the idea is that it's the stories like told by somebody instead of you reading directly from the author kind of thing. So that's kind of very different. And it's how he initially created part of these stories, or like the first drafts, and his son Christopher Tolkien published them that way, apparently. So
and there's a lot of spaking going on.
Yes, a lot of spaking going on. Definitely.
Yes, that's not a bad word, by the way. To the
Definitely not. Definitely not.
We don't have to bleep that out.
It's not. So as we were speaking in the last time, it was about your chat that you had in Gamification Europe in Amsterdam. You were talking about the NES, net engagement score. And apparently it's been working out pretty well for you and probably for your clients as well. But I would like to know, as I started, inducing, like, what have you been working on after that? Like, I don't know, maybe some projects that have benefited from this new framework that you're going to be talking about. Like, what can you tell us in that direction? What have you been doing and working on so that we can have an idea of what this could be sort of useful for?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think that's a great way to set the stage for our webinar, because as our research has evolved since we last spoke, what we're seeing more and more of is this emphasis within, in particular, enterprises and organizations that have large communities where there's a lot of rich data that's potentially available to diagnose and segment your audiences. The inability of people to look at their communities and to be able to draw meaningful conclusions from patterns of behavior is astonishing. You would not believe some of the conversations that we've had with, I'm not going to name names for sure, but organizations that you would assume on paper, on the surface, have their finger on the pulse of their community, because all they do all day, almost as a course of business, is collect data. And you would be astonished to realize how siloed and segmented that data is, to the point where they have no spaking clue of what their community wants, needs, how they can become better customers or community members. It is shocking. And something that came out of last year, 2019's Adobe Digital Trends document, which, by the way, is an amazing reference document. I encourage everybody to look it up. Again, another thing you can get for free that is really, really worth something. It's called 2019 Digital Trends by Adobe. And in it, the author of the report, who's the senior marketing director at Adobe, John Watton, at the time, I think he's moved on to something else since. But he describes how first-class customer experiences or community experiences, they need to be at the center of commercial strategies. The reason is that they are vital to competitive differentiation and increasingly just for survival. So what that means is, unless you're paying attention to your customers and their needs and their wants across all dimensions of being a customer, then not only are you not one of the top businesses or organizations in your vertical, but you're going to struggle to survive. Because today we do have the technology, it's all available, that we can figure out and know how the audiences are segmented and what the next best thing is for each individual to do. And unless you have that information and know how to structure an experience where you give them the next possible step, what you're doing is just sailing a boat, to the horizon, and you're going to fall off the cliff. Everybody else is going to leave you in the dust. So these are exciting times if you can grasp that idea. And that's most of what we're going to be talking about in the webinar, is just how that notion of customer-centric interaction and the relationship between the customer and the brand, how you can foster and nurture that.
So that sounds very interesting. And the first thing that comes to my mind when you were mentioning that, actually the second one, the first one I'll mention right after. Second thing that comes to my mind is, it sounds like it's geared a bit more, like it's especially geared, so to speak, to large or larger organizations. Is that right?
So the reason I would say yes to so the idea of it is universally applicable. So anyone that comes to the webinar will get something out of it. However, where the particular value kicks in is where you have large-scale audiences that are generating a lot of data, because the more data you have, the more confident you can be around the
Exactly.
segments that you create and around the way that the data can tell the story is much more robust.
Yeah, exactly. That's part of what I was getting at. I mean, if you don't have a large amount of data, you can't. I mean, even calling it big data wouldn't make much sense. And of course, the conclusions that you can draw out of it are completely different. It's more sort of statistical than you could gather from something like a large organization with a large community and so on. So I think there is a first sort of clue of what it's going to look like. And the first thing that did come to my mind when you were mentioning that is about free. And I completely agree that in the end, you get what you pay for, but there's many ways of paying for things. One of them is definitely with attention and what might come afterwards. And that's definitely something that in today's economy is happening more and more. I mean, we're in a podcast. Most podcasts like this one are for free. And what you're getting has not necessarily direct relation with what you're giving in a financial sense. It's more in the attention space. Some podcasts have sponsors, so you're sort of paying with your attention to listening to these sponsors so that the show remains free. That kind of thing is going on more and more. And I do think that there is a lot of value that is being offered by many interesting people as far as free webinars that have a lot of value. And of course, you maybe say, well, this has a lot of value. And if this is for free, how does the, paid stuff look like? I mean, and hopefully there will be many things that are being developed and created in that sense to entice people to say, well, I mean, if this is the free stuff, then the paid stuff has to be like absolutely incredible. And there will be a group of people who can and are willing to pay whatever the paid stuff looks like. So that was my other message that I think is very important, especially for the webinar that you will be conducting very, very soon, because we're recording this slightly before the webinar. I would like to get a little bit into the details of what that webinar will look like as far as timing and so on. And then I do have a question about the topic, because we've been like dancing around it and we can still dance around it a bit more. But as far as details, things like when is it going to be? How long is it going to last? I mean, you will be able to find the link to register definitely in the show notes of this episode. So in professorgame.com, you go type Steve because your last name is super difficult to type. And you will find this episode definitely, the latest one, and you will get the link there. What will that link take us to? What does it look like? Why would we want to register for such a webinar?
Yeah, well, so just backing up on what you were saying before,
Sure.
with free, the idea of free being
the concept.
one of my the concept of it. Yes, it is one of my favorite 4-letter F words. With that you can say on the radio. The other one is food, another favorite 4-letter F word. When those two are together, free food, oh man, I'm happy. I'm a happy guy. And as far as value goes, Professor Game is one of the best values on the internet right now. I'm convinced that nobody has ever asked for their money back.
You're
after
too
listening
kind.
to your podcast. Nobody has ever asked for their money back. So when you say that, what's interesting about that idea of free is you've almost unwittingly, Rob, stumbled into some of the central or main theses within the webinar itself, because what people are going to hear is essentially a retrospective on the notion of the customer pyramid. So back in 2001, Lemon, Rustin, Zeitmal had published a paper in, I believe, the Harvard Business Review on the customer pyramid. They described this hierarchy of customers that goes from lead up to iron to gold and platinum. And people really embrace this idea. But if you dig into their paper, what you realize is that their view or their perspective of a customer's value to an organization, and you can replace customer with community, it was very transactional. So the idea was, you are valuable to me as a customer if you are conducting a transaction with me. And what you just said a moment ago, Rob, about how free is more valuable than you think it is exactly what we've layered over top of this. So one of the criticisms of the traditional customer pyramid that we had was that it was very one-dimensional. So when you think about the very wide range of kinds of interactions and touch points that exist between a customer and a brand, or between a community and the organization, so much of it is not transactional. So it's not just about how much money I spend with you as a customer. There's also aspects of social interaction with other customers, how I communicate your brand to other people, how I participate on your social media channels, whether I visit your physical store, even if I'm not buying something. Like, you can't tell me that those ideas, those notions don't provide value. It's not just about what they spend.
Well, and crowdsourcing nowadays, I mean, ignoring the value of crowdsourcing as well is quite hard nowadays.
Of course. So there's another good one, right? Content generation, like content creation from your community, which they're volunteering their time. They're putting their own valuable time into doing for you, and how you should cherish that and how that should be recognized. So what we're going to be looking at in this podcast is essentially a new way of picturing that customer pyramid.
In the webinar.
Sorry, what did I say?
In the podcast.
in the webinar, yes. You're already listening to the podcast. When you click through to the webinar, which is going to be a 45-minute webinar that we have scheduled on, well, I'm going to have to do a little bit of mental math here, because we're doing it from Vancouver on Wednesday, the 22nd of January, but that's going to be at 11 a.m. Pacific time, which is, I guess, about 8 p.m. in most of Europe.
Oh, don't try to do the time zone difference. I'm sure there's a button that can change that on the internet.
Yes. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. You can click through it. It'll convert it. We tried to pick a time that made the most sense for most of the planet. Good. So we did our best. And when you click on it on the 22nd, you're going to, in fact, we encourage people to pre-register, because there may be a cap on the number of participants that we can allow in. What you're going to hear is us basically taking the users, the listeners, through some visuals that will show them how this idea has evolved, give them a little bit of the backstory, show them how technologies can be applied to solving this problem of moving the customer up the pyramid. Ultimately, that's what we want to do. Ultimately, when you have a customer that enters your pyramid at the low level, at the lead level, you want to move them up to iron, and then up to gold, and then up to platinum, and have them stay there. Once they get above gold, you've got a loyal customer. There's very little cross-migration between other pyramids above that level. So you want to maximize the top tier of your pyramid. You want the tip of it to be as fat and as big as possible. And we're going to be talking about strategy. First of all, we're going to be talking about how you can better segment the people within that pyramid, so it's not just 4 bands, and also talk about the strategies for moving them up that pyramid, the consequences of that, how that leads to higher retention, higher loyalty, deeper engagement, and ultimately more profitability or better responses to calls to action, and how you would technically implement solutions like that in a way that nobody else is doing right now. So very exciting for us to be able to bring these ideas to market. And we're looking forward to not only the webinar, but the discussion that is inevitably going to ensue following that.
Sounds fantastic. And one question, because you mentioned several times the pyramid, could you very briefly say what those tiers look like? Like, what does lead look like? What does iron, gold, and platinum look like? What does that mean? Is there a way to sort of touch those concepts?
Well, and this is where we thought that the original model could be improved. So if you read the original paper, they describe it. So you talk to any marketer, they understand the customer pyramid, but the short-sightedness in it is that it is transactional. So lead is essentially customers that only spend a certain amount of money. So the way it works is...
and that probably depends on the type of products you sell, I guess.
Absolutely, yes. And there are examples in the research, in the historic research, where they've applied this to different, models, different industries, whatever. But again, very short-sighted because it looks at transactions. So essentially the top part of the pyramid, the top few percent, you can look at different papers that quantified in different ways, but usually single-digit percentages, say 5 to 10% is going to be your platinum customer. Platinum and gold probably account for 80% of your revenue. So those are the whales. Those are the heavy spenders.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So that's the criteria. It's very one-dimensional. What we're doing is breaking that model open. We're applying basically layering on additional criteria, looking at how you can create segments within that, and then looking at how, at the time, that was 20 years ago when they came out with this model, the technology wasn't available. I don't even blame them for looking at the world this way. Thusly, I spake. What we're doing today is essentially leveraging the technology that's available to be able to improve this model and to give a completely new perspective on how you should be looking at your communities, your customers.
I mean, you can't blame them for not knowing Facebook and Instagram and all these social media was going to come up when it didn't exist. So yeah,
no, absolutely. And even then, when marketing was in full swing, it was traditional marketing. So the traceability on that was very poor. So what else could you do but say it's all about how much money you spend, and that's how we're going to group you. So we're going to look at that in a completely different way. We're going to show you why it's important, more important now than it's ever been before, and how technology, as strange as it sounds, having a technology company and having a background in video games, usually I look at technology as the last resort for solving problems. And yet in this case, it's really the only way that you can do this and do it properly. It's exciting what you can do. It's exciting how stable and reliable and affordable the technologies have become. And we'll talk a bit about that in the session as well.
Absolutely. And many things have changed since then. There's so much that, has happened since then that I'm sure there's many things sort of, as you mentioned at some point, to crack open and see what that looks like and incorporate new things. I mean, in marketing, as you said, that there were many things that were in the traceability not even available. But I did have a further question, and this might be very interesting as well to the audience, because given your background, given what you generally do, what do games play or gamification play in this scenario? Like, is there something that some headlines that you can give us, or maybe something that is not within the webinar itself that you might say, well, all these things fit together because of, these things, or this is what it's all about? Is there something that you can talk about that in that sense without giving away the whole webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying, if you're talking about the kind of thin, cheap, slapping some badges and points around gamification,
it's not there.
It's not there. It doesn't have a lot to do with this. If you're talking about the more enriching and complex, powerful kind of gamification that I'm much more familiar with my background, which is game design, there's a lot going on here, because when you enter any complex game system, you look at everything from the World of Warcrafts all the way up to Diablo, any kind of strategy game, any kind of role-playing game, anything that's, we'll even go down to the Nintendo level of games that have a very broad range of appeal. You can be a casual gamer, you can be a hardcore gamer. It all makes sense to you somehow or another. That first walk through that door as a player, we as game designers need to segment you immediately. We need to know who you are, how good you are, and what's the next breadcrumb we need to put in front of you. And that's exactly what I'm describing here. That's exactly what the corporate world is not doing. So the corporate world is not sophisticated in their view. They don't know how to segment their customers effectively. The data is poorly available and siloed. And what we realized was they weren't even using the right model, because the customer pyramid, which is a very common notion, isn't powerful enough to harness these ideas of multiple data sources across all of these different touch points, digital touch points that the customer brand has in common. So that's just that part of it, which is the segmentation and the call it questing. And then once you've laid out the next best step for that customer or that community member, you need to reward them, and that funnels down. So you lay out these quests, you get people doing more of what they need to be doing to move up the customer pyramid. You convert that behavior in the completion of those challenges. You convert that to some kind of currency, some abstraction of good behavior. And and then you give them that bank balance. You let them do something interesting and fun with it that's on brand, that's on point, that's driving more business values or business outcomes. And that loops them back up to the questing layer so that there's more things for them to do. So what I just described is every video game that has experienced or enjoyed any level of success in the world. You come in, we figure out who you are, we give you the next best thing to do, we make you feel good about it, we give you some recognition, reward for it, which you then can use in a way that expands your status, that expands your attraction with the game. In many cases, you're given a currency, which then lets you unlock new things.
Within the game itself.
Within the game itself, right? So it creates an engagement loop. So there's many different ways that this can be articulated, but that loop of come in, we teach you, you get started, you get better, you get recognized, you get some sort of looping, some sort of back loop for you to want to do more. Now, what we talked about last time we spoke, Rob, was the engagement score and how you have to be careful because you can actually overdo that. You can over-engage people. And in the context of gamification, the risks you have, too much engagement is not a good thing. It's great in video games where the product is engagement. That's what you're trying to sell. You can engage people to their heart's content. All they're going to feel is a greater sense of value for the money that they spent. In gamification, too much engagement can be a distraction from the core purpose, which is some business outcome. So you got to keep the dial at the right number. You can fiddle with it a little bit. You can experiment, turn it up and down, but you're going to find the sweet spot, the one where people are engaged, but also participating in whatever business goals you have for them. You don't want them too distracted away from that.
Absolutely. And that makes a lot of sense. That I think it's pretty much full circle. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add as far as the webinar, because there is a final question that I'd like to make, I always make, which is the random question from the audience.
Yeah, nothing I want to add, because otherwise I'm going to tell them more now than I will in the webinar itself. So I want them to come. So we'll leave it at that for now.
Fantastic. So for the final question of today, we will have one of the questions from the audience. This time, I have to say, I did some cheat codes. I went into the questions and I said, well, what are we going to be talking about today? Because I wanted for this question to make sense with the kind of interview that we had today. And that is, in my view, at least, and I'm the game designer this time, it's okay, because that is making the game more entertaining of this podcast. So the question that I got from the audience is, and this is the kind of, sort of reflective, it sounds very philosophical question, but I'm sure you'll drive it into something a lot more practical. And it's the question of, if you think that gamification can solve, and the key word here is any problem. Do you think so? If yes, why, or what are some examples? And if not, some counter examples, and, dive deep into that if you wish. Steve, what do you think?
Can gamification solve any problem? It cannot solve the problem of death. That's probably it's probably the biggest problem we all face. I don't know. Maybe death isn't a problem. Maybe we need to have that. Although, let's see.
To keep on in the Tolkien space, that was the gift from the gods to mankind. Death was one of the gifts. So
yes, to make our experience, to make our lives more precious, I guess. So no, can't solve things. Well, you can put the fun into funeral. You could, I suppose, up to that moment.
Do you want to is the next question, depending on the culture, I guess.
Is it appropriate? So I'm gonna deconstruct your question a little bit. Can it solve every problem? Maybe, but I think that the bigger question is, do you want it to? Does it make sense? Like, is it possible for you to use the mechanic of gamification to break down a problem and to motivate or to stimulate or to encourage somebody to appropriately and sensibly take the next step towards solving that problem? And can you even layer additional technologies in, like AI and machine learning and virtual reality? Like, can you keep expanding it? I believe that there's ways to do just about anything. However, like we're saying, the question really is, should you? And we often get people walking in saying, "Hey, we need some gamification," and to me, it feels like a big checkbox that they need to put a pen into. But I always respond to that with, what are you trying to do? Like, does it even make sense? Like, are you the kind of organization that would benefit from this? And does your community want it? Like, is it just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should? And to look at it that way, to look at, as I said before, technology isn't my first choice for solving problems. Sometimes there's a cleaner, simpler way, and that goes equally for gamification. Sometimes if you want to make something fun, you don't even need technology to do it. You can just change the tone. You can just add a bit of humor. It's not always necessary. So yeah, that's, without getting too philosophical, I love conversations like that, but this could easily stretch into a few hours, which neither of us probably has right now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming today. We're happy to have you here. Hopefully many of the engagers are going to join you in that fantastic webinar. I think for me, it's kind of feasible. I'll check the calendar as well to make sure I can be there. Hopefully I will be. I will be making you the tough questions during the webinar if I'm there. So you'll be able to identify that user is like 123797. That user is going to be me making the hard questions.
You're going to be one of those. Can't I seed you with some softball questions?
You have to send them in advance.
I'll send. Yeah, like, Steve, how did you get so smart? What's it like being a handsome, successful guy like you?
Those are the kind of questions you'll have as well, I'm sure.
Yeah,
sure.
They're horrible, inaccurate questions that make no sense to ask someone like me, but easier than the ones that I might get from a smart guy like you.
Hopefully. So I'm sure many of the engagers will be heading over directly there. You will be able to find all these details in professorgain.com. You look for Steve. If you want to try the last name, it's Bocska. It's Bocska. Did I get it right this time?
Bocska. That's
yes. Right. So if you type that, you'll find episode 68, which is the first episode we did together. And you will find this episode on basically the webinar that Steve is going to be conducting. He gave us quite a few clues to see if we could be interested. I know I am for a change. I'm interested in these things most of the times, at least. Hopefully that you will be heading there. Is there anything else that you wanna tell us, Steve? Any final, piece of advice? Anything? Any final message you want to leave before we say it's game over?
No. Before you dismiss the class, I want to say it's always a pleasure talking to you, Rob, and I love what you're doing here. And again, for my money, there is no better podcast on the internet right now than Professor Game.
Thank you very much, Steve. That's kind of you once again. Thank you very much to the audience for bearing with us, laughing here, going back and forth. Hopefully it was entertaining for you as well, because it was entertaining for us. And hopefully you will find a lot of value both in this episode and in the webinar, which I definitely rush you to go and register for. But for now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this special interview with Steve. And how are you listening right now? If you're doing it through a podcasting app, is there a chance that you have subscribed and rated this podcast? If you haven't, please go ahead and do so. I know we podcasters tend to say this very much, but it's because that way we can reach more engagers like you to achieve this mission of making learning amazing. And if you want to know, if you haven't realized how it works, you can go to professorgame.com/iTunes and you'll find the instructions for a couple of those podcasting apps. And before you go on to your next mission, would you like to hear from Michael Rucker? Then subscribe using your favorite podcast app, as I mentioned before, and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.